Hello, everyone. We're back straight on the heels of the Queer Disrupt conference with another episode of the Queer Disrupt podcast. I'm very excited about this one as it looks at queerness and science fiction. In particular, this episode looks at the American novelist Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness and asks questions about the story and the universe it's set in. Looking at the unique world created by Le Guin in the novel, James Whitfield, Roxanne Douglas and Bean Sharp discuss queer coding, the way sex and gender are conceived, and the potential utopic or perhaps dystopic possibilities of the world in the book. Join us and them and generally I for this episode of the Queer Disrupt podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Queer Disrupt Podcasts. Just wanted to begin with a very quick thank you to everyone who is listening and following Queer Disrupt on various social media channels and on the podcast itself. Thank you so much. It's incredible. So this is my first time hosting a podcast for Queer Disrupt, and I am super excited. So my name is James Whitfield, and I am a committee member on Queer Disrupt, and I am a PhD student currently whose research involves looking at discourses surrounding prisoner deaths with a focus on transgender and minority ethnic inmates. I am also in love with everything science fiction, everything possible, and I cannot wait to get started talking about The Left Hand of Darkness. Joining me to discuss this book are two wonderful academics, Bean Sharp and Roxanne Douglas. I will let them introduce themselves because they will do an amazing job of that and a far better job than I will.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. I'm Roxanne Douglas. I'm currently a teaching fellow over in the English and Comparative Literary Studies department at Warwick. My research focuses on Arab feminist fiction, but I also have expertise in first and second wave feminism in the Anglophone world. And I'm also a bit of a gothicist at heart, and I also publish on things like zombies. So I'm sort of a master of none, really. I'm a big fan of all things science fiction, and I draw on queer theory whenever I can, really. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
And I'm Bean. I recently was awarded my PhD in English and American Studies for my thesis, which was titled Monsters, Time Travel and Aliens, Tracing the Genealogies of Trans Through Feminist Science Fiction, Writing and Film. This was an interdisciplinary research project that was funded by the University of Manchester. I'm currently adapting a chapter of this thesis for publication as an article, which I'm tentatively titling Strange Temporalities, Untangling Trans Historicities with Feminist Time Travel Films. And I'm also investigating how trans-authored speculative fiction writing might offer ways to interrogate and intervene in current debates on trans rights, with a particular interest in the writing of Tori Peters and Isabel Four. So I'm very excited to be here, getting to talk about one of my favourite books of all time, The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin.
Thank you both so much. So I now first want to introduce the novel. This will hopefully act as a nice reminder for our listeners of the events that occurred within it. So the novel is centered around Genli I, who's a male native of Terra, who arrives on Gethin, an icy cold planet, to ensure the nations on the planet join the Ecumen, who are a union of planets dedicated to sharing knowledge. On his way, he meets Estraven, Prime Minister of the nation Karhide, who attempts to help him do this. Everyone upon the planet is androgynous. They have no settled sex until Kema once a month, when they take on sexed characteristics, meaning they have no male or female gender. The conflict of the novel settles around two nations, Karhide and Orgorian, who are close to going to war. And when attempting to convince Orgorian to join the Union, Genli is betrayed and sent to a voluntary farm and is rescued by Estraven, who travels with him to Karhide. And after reaching the nation, Estraven dies tragically. So within this, we want to talk about a few things. We want to talk about the historical context that the novel is situated within, but we also want to discuss two kind of major themes that we have found, which are kind of gender. So obviously the gendering of people, but also pronouns and kind of the debates that have been surrounding the book because of that. And also questions of the queer utopia, kind of what utopian queer visions we can imagine from the book. And I kind of wanted to get started. So I am really excited to talk about the historical context because I didn't really think about too much until I got together with Roxanne and Bean and started to understand what is involved within it, essentially.
So obviously, as someone who's a scholar of feminism and sometimes feminist history, I didn't really, although obviously this text brings up lots of questions about gender, which we'll get into later, and it was written in the 1960s. I should have put 2 and 2 together and made 4, but actually, like, it wasn't until we were working on this podcast that I started really thinking about the gendered and literary and feminist histories that actually Guin was maybe writing, like, emerging from during this time. So to kind of kick us off, maybe, if that's okay, one of the big things around this text that I've been thinking about quite a lot is, given that it was published in 1969, it would have been sort of conceived of, to put too fine a point on it, and written around the time that the contraceptive pill was becoming more widely available in the US and in the UK. I mean, maybe some of the listeners have heard of the swinging 60s, and there was a good reason why it was called that, right? Like, all of a sudden, well, it wasn't really sudden, it was actually done in legally very gradually, but the FDA in the US approved the contraceptive oral pill in the 1960s, and it became available initially to married women in all states in 1965, following a legal battle in Connecticut. But then it wasn't until 1972 that it was available to unmarried women. So given that the left hand of darkness sits like almost between these 2 points, suggests that there would have been a historical kind of conversation around women's ability to control their own reproductive process, or, you know, bodily autonomy and things like that, that I find so interesting in relationship to this novel, where the thing that I remembered most about it from reading it before was this really imaginative thing about the chema and not having a gender until you need a gender, or not having a sex until you need a sex for sexual purposes. And the reason why this is so interesting to me is because the pill contains estrogen and progestogen, which actually stops people with wombs ovulating. Now, I was thinking about this, I was like, in relationship to chema, it almost is like a reverse chema, like it sort of stops those biological processes. I don't know, like there's something rich in there in the kind of real science and then the science fiction that emerges from this, I think. Likewise, maybe this is just me going off on a whim, but I also think that Esteban, the Prime Minister, who is, as Le Guin also kind of noted herself later on, is kind of coded as mostly male, sounds a bit like estrogen to me. And I just think that's cool and interesting.
I was thinking that as well. I was noticing on rereading it how much estrogen sounds like estrogen, and even estra, where estrogen comes from. That's the root of estrogen is like estra, and it's that same sort of linguistic root. So like, yeah, it seemed to be quite intentional, that play.
I mean, to kind of give listeners potentially a peek behind the curtain, during and before recording, wondering how to say Ori. See, even I'm struggling now. Bean, help me. Augerine. Okay, great. Which is spelled, for the listener who does not have it written down in front of them, Orgoreyn. Maybe I'm leaning too far out the window here, but that ending of EYN suggests to me, you know, in the US you have an OBGYN who is the doctor who would see to genitals or gender, and then like the ending like gynin and sort of suggests to me like gynae. So I don't think any of this would have been lost on the Guin, but I don't know how intentional all of this is. But I just think it's fun to play with words, no?
Very much. I fully agree. But I also think you're right to take it in that direction, because throughout the entire book there are references. I mean, the entirety of chema is kind of evocative of a menstruation cycle, essentially. So everything within the book has these kind of connotations within them. And so I think you can make those links because essentially Le Guin has already made it so explicit.
One of the things that I think is so interesting about kind of thinking about the contraceptive pill and the kind of advent of the contraceptive pill alongside this text, well, there's a couple of different things. The first is the biological stuff. So obviously in The Left Hand of Darkness, anyone who's in permanent chema, like the word they use in the text is a pervert, and there's, you know, a lot of kind of internal slurs in the lore of the text. But if you are someone who can get pregnant, who uses the pill, you are in a permanent state of kind of tricking your body into thinking you're already pregnant. So there's this interesting kind of, I don't know how much Le Guin would have actually known about the way that the contraceptive pill worked. But yeah, I think there's something really interesting there. But the second thing is the more kind of sociological, kind of political reasons why the pill was so important. So obviously, people who can get pregnant want to determine whether or not they actually do. I think that's fairly, obvious. We all want to be bonking freely. However, the reason for that is kind of economic problems that come around childbearing, or the economic challenges that come around childbearing. So for people who can get pregnant, the kind of challenge is that typically women or people who can get pregnant tend to get kind of lumped with unwanted children, and they therefore face even if they are wanted children, in fact, they tend to face the economic burden. So when we kind of read this real life context around why people who can get pregnant want to have the pill in the 1960s, we also have the kind of interesting hearth and family system that's in these kind of interesting pods where the burden of child rearing is shared a little bit more widely and, doesn't seem to have an individual economic burden on the flesh parent, as they're called in the text. So yeah, to me, I had such a nice time thinking about sort of the second wave push towards reproductive rights, simply because it's so in there. It's so in there.
It's quite, I know we're going to be talking in a bit more depth about the sort of utopian elements of the text later, but certainly something that really struck me on rereading it was in the sort of little ethnographic descriptions that sort of are dotted throughout the text, these little mini chapters that go into more depth about Githenian culture and systems. There's a mention somewhere of how everybody gets time off work when they're on chemo. I think that's sort of I imagine that emerged out of some of the conversations going on in feminist thought at the time about asking for time off work for menstruation or just for sickness, and like a debate about labour rights and the ways in which women are not really thought of, in terms of labour rights at that point in time. So aspects of this text that I found really exciting still, the sort of like utopian promise, but then there are other aspects of the text that almost seem quite depressing to read now, because clearly Le Guin was in conversation with some really exciting feminist ideas at the time, but the text was actually quite harshly criticised by some other feminist writers and feminist science fiction writers, particularly because of the protagonist, who's this human Terran, so from a man from Earth. He is quite sort of sexist and has quite rigid views on sex and gender, and is very much sort of projecting his own ideas about masculinity and femininity onto the Githenians that he encounters. Like, I can understand what Le Guin is doing here and trying to kind of present the world through this man's eyes, but there's something quite depressing about thinking, well, in order for this to be the case in this future, this wouldn't be what it would be like to send a man from our current present there now. It almost, for the text to make sense, there almost needs to have been like a loss in feminist gains and a return to something much more binary, like a much more patriarchal understandings of sex and gender in the future. So there's something very sad and depressing at the foundational level of this text.
I get what you're saying, because, Le Guin also says this herself when she writes she double writes an essay called Is Gender Necessary, right? And then she goes back and puts interesting notes on it. But even in that text, she says, if I'd have written it 7 years later, it would have been a different text again. And I think one of the big things to remember when we're kind of encountering this text is in 1969, and the sort of preceding years where she was probably thinking about it and writing, one of the big things that was happening in feminism was it was actually a complete renegotiation of what it even means to have gender roles and women's place in society. Women were affirming their place in the workplace. Women were not only they were already kind of petitioned for their role in the political arena through suffrage, as Le Guin points out 50 years earlier. However, there were all these kind of crises within feminism about what it means to be feminine and what it means to be a woman, and what these categories and what these shades of identity even meant on a social level. Can you be feminine but also a CEO? Later on, neoliberal feminism sort of tries to answer this question really badly, in my opinion. But we haven't got time for that today.
just not a little bit, just a little bit too little time.
A little bit too much. So in the UK, a lot of second wave feminism and this renegotiation of how we should even arrange our society was emerging from a socialist consciousness. I think this was potentially the same case in the US, but in essence, feminism was really questioning, like, does our society even have to look this way? Do we even have to have gender roles in this way? Do we even have to have the family in the way that we do? Hence the urgency, I think, of the, not to bang the same drum, but the contraceptive pill was really, really important because it allowed women and people who can get pregnant to renegotiate their place in society on economic terms. So you're quite right, like if this was written now or 20 years ago or even 7 years after it was, would we have the same text? Probably not, because these questions wouldn't have been quite so urgent and emergent at the time.
They are, and it's interesting that these questions are so fundamental to the text. And there is another interesting quote that I found in relation to the more utopian aspects of Kemmer, although we're going to want to talk about that a bit later as well. I just wanted to say that there's a suggestion within it, because everything is shared so equally across the entire society. There is a place within the text that says that the people on Genthen are not as free as a man is. And that is kind of a very provocative statement to make in relation to this. And it's actually not made by Genli, I don't think. I think it's made by another commentator on the actual state of the planet itself. And I found it kind of distressing that that was the attitude taken, because it seems to suggest that equality negates freedom in a certain sense, because what happens is when there is an equal distribution and equal potential for child rearing to affect everyone equally, then there is a lack of freedom for the man, which is something that is quite problematic. And I find with the text surprising that it didn't seem to be Genli stating it. So it wasn't the protagonist, who is already we know is quite sexist and involved in this transition, but is someone else who is outside that zone.
I mean, I wonder if this speaks to a little bit the anti-feminist sentiment at the time, which was very heavily reliant on this question of, would you rather have freedom to, or would you rather have freedom from? For anyone who might have watched Mrs. America recently, as we know, Phyllis Schlafly, she was very interested in this question of women's rights within the home or women's rights as women in this very gendered way, i.e. the freedom from, as she saw it, if you're married, you have freedom from the workplace to do, domestic tasks or be a domestic kind of, I don't even know how you put it. It's just so far beyond my politics, I suppose. But yeah, to kind of reach back to what you were saying, this question of, do gender roles actually empower us? I do think it's a little bit problematic. Well, I do think it's quite problematic, actually. But I wonder if it is, as I say, emerging from just like the really tricky and knotty questions that were happening at the time. Because one of the things I want to be careful of, at least in my own reading, is not ascribing, our values and understanding of gender from 2021 onto a text of 1969. Obviously we should hold things to a high standard, but sometimes these things are, coming from an emergent historical moment, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it also could be a result also of Le Guin even portraying the other people who are investigating Genthen as a society that is more patriarchal and internalize these patriarchal sort of values as well.
I mean, this is the funny question, isn't it? Maybe this is sort of shifting us onto our first topic a bit too soon. But basically, as we all know, this text uses he, him pronouns predominantly. The name for the monarch is a king, leading us to that really tasty sentence of the king is pregnant. I mean, come on now, beautiful bit of prose there. So the question I have is, even if we don't have gender, is it even beyond someone who is such a science fiction master as Le Guin to even be able to imagine beyond something that is at least shaded with patriarchy? Because even the way that the hearth system is set up, yes, there's a sort of queer utopian sense to them in as much as you're not necessarily, for want of a better word, burdened by your offspring. But at the same time, one of the main contentions in the book is that the king does not have a flesh child as a proper heir. So there is still a kind of sense of ensuring some kind of familial or genetic poetic right to things, which imaginatively I think comes from patriarchy, even though in traditional patriarchy men don't tend to carry children, which we know now is not true, but in the way that it's all been set up in our society, I suppose.
Yeah, that's something that I find quite interesting about the text, thinking about the context in which it was written, because this was published in 1969, which, as I'm sure many of our listeners will know, is the same year as the Stonewall Inn riots. So even before that, you've got the sort of Compton's cafeteria riot and other sort of incidents in history of queer uprisings. And there's something about the text that is almost decidedly not queer. It almost doesn't seem in dialogue with these events going on or discussions going on. And that's something that she somewhat reflects on in the Is Gender Necessary Redux essay, was this sort of absence of homosexuality in the text. And that there's sort of a homoerotic tension between Esteban and Genli, but that's sort of almost given a heterosexual cover by Esteban's womanliness that Genli is attracted to. So there are ways in which I feel that the text is actually a lot more like a lot less queer. Yeah. So that often when I'm asked about my research and people are keen to talk to me about the science fiction texts I've come across and the ones that they're sort of expecting me to be researching, and The Left-Hand of Darkness is a text that comes up a lot because it's thought of as a sort of trans text or a queer text because of these sort of like not just ambiguously gendered but fluid gender transitions through the text. And yet there are ways in which it's almost like a quite heteronormative thought experiment about gender and sexuality. So there are ways in which I'm sort of definitely very excited by the text and what it does with gender and sex, but ways in which it really pauses before kind of engaging with things that were going on at the time about sort of queer and trans thinking.
I fully agree. Yeah. Throughout the text, I think that's very clear, because there's even a part within it that refers to sort of same-sex chemering as something that does not occur or is too rare to be worth commenting upon. And those sorts of statements seem to demonstrate what you're saying, is that actually, despite being in some aspects really interesting when it comes to gender and sexuality, it doesn't actually engage too thoroughly sometimes with queer topics. It seems to eschew them to some extent and to kind of focus a bit more on envisioning a society with more egalitarian distribution of pregnancy as the workload associated with child rearing and that sort of thing.
I think some of this investment in a very binary, like despite the text being thought of as something that is about disrupting a gender binary, it is still very much invested in a quite essentialist and binary understanding of sex and gender, which I don't think can only be explained away by talking about the sort of sexist or patriarchal perspective of the protagonist, Genli. Like, I think these are things that come up in the rest of Le Guin's work and in other things that she has written. Yeah, I think she's often thinking about male and female as a duality, and I think this investment in a male-female duality relates to Le Guin's interest in Taoist philosophy and Native American and Eastern philosophies, and she very much takes from them ideas about balance and sort of polarities and the sort of tensions between them, but as much as she's trying to kind of discuss ways in which they're sort of interdependent, she's still very much thinking in those kind of binary terms.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're right. Like, you know, this is something that is in Le Guin's other work, and there's like lots of critical scholarship that our listeners can have a little look at. However, I think sometimes we can say that actually the text doesn't belong to Le Guin anymore, it belongs to us. So I think there's also exciting, I think your criticism is absolutely right, by the way, I'm not disagreeing, but I think we can maybe read into the text, because the text itself is a question, right? It's a question about like, what if we don't have gender roles in the way that we conceive them on Earth in our present moment or in the 1960s? Because I remember the point that you were talking about, James, where it's like, oh, same-sex chemering is so infrequent so as not to be important. But the reading that I would suggest of that is that's what Genli points out. And so maybe it was just that like Genli isn't into the queer scene on Winter. Like, maybe there is, like, you know, I mean, I know that obviously Le Guin actually talks about this in her kind of reflective essays on the Left Hand of Darkness, and she does say that she does regret not having more of a gesture towards like these possibilities. As you rightly pointed out, being she had this like utilitarian understanding of what like sex and even sexual pleasure and those kinds of things were for. But, you know, it's just fun to have a headcanon that maybe Genlei was so like bro-y that he never found the LGBTs, the equivalent of a LGBT scene.
I love the idea that Genlei is basically just a bro. That is incredible.
Because this is the other thing I want to kind of pull out of this, like, is Genlei a bro discussion? Because, Dean, you mentioned that there is kind of this, yeah, I would call it homoerotic, but as you say, it is masked. What do we make of Genlei's and Estraven's kind of vibe, basically? Like, they go on this... You know, they go on this long trek and it's cold and, you know, there's this, you know, I mean, come on, like the fan fiction writes itself, doesn't it? Because Le Guin does say that she coded Estraven as vaguely masculine in as much as like the roles that Estraven takes up. And, you know, she said that she found this joy in this, what she calls in Is Gender Necessary, a man-woman, which is maybe a term we don't want to, you know, replicate in our current historic moment. But the point was that she was so excited to see someone who was androgynous doing all these physical things and holding these kind of moments of state power that she kind of forgot that all of these things are still in our current moment, or at the moment at the time was still coded as male. So, I mean, at one point, I think Genlei does say like my love for him, but it's coded enough to sort of be like, is it that kind of, how do I put it, like a bromance is the only other way I can think. So look, on the one hand, obviously, we can read things however we want to, and it would be great to see, you know, that the kind of consequence of having an alien like Genlei on Winter is that queerness emerges in some way, in a way that, as being rightly pointed out earlier, like isn't actually necessarily built into the society and into the way that this society works, as Le Guin puts it. However, at the same time, I also do want to see more like homosocial relationships that are very affectionate, especially among like men and male coded people, because like our current society does not allow men and people who are kind of seen as masculine to exhibit these kinds of affectionate, you know, relationships. So I don't know, I'm torn. Like, do we ship them or not is my question.
I just want to jump in here and maybe flip some of what we've been saying on its head a little bit and say, okay, there is like another way of thinking this as a bromance, and that is the emphasis on the bro in bromance, in the sense of brother, because there's a lot of incest in this book. Maybe that's the aspect of this book that's queer that actually does get overlooked, because queerness on Gethin, the kind of queerness in the sense of perverse and excluded sexualities, are these relationships between siblings that go beyond. So you're on Gethin, incest is allowed between siblings only, but you can only have one child together. You cannot chema for life. You cannot sort of agree to be each other's kind of soulmates permanently, because you're only allowed to have one child and then you have to separate. So love relationships between siblings that go beyond having a one-off kind of thing, or having one child and then separating, they're seen as really taboo. That's the kind of relationship that, well, Estraven has had one of these relationships. The text seems to suggest there are lots of references to a sibling who's now dead, who Estraven once vowed to kind of kennel with forever, which is not tolerated in their society. And so there's this hint of Estraven as already being a kind of stigmatized, or a character with this taboo in his history, and he's projecting a lot of his feelings onto Genlei, because there are points where he's sort of, when they have this mind speech, when they're speaking to each other in psychically, Estraven is hearing Genlei's voice as the voice of his brother, his long lost and beloved brother. And so there are ways in which that relationship is homoerotic in ways that we can't even really properly conceive of, because we don't live in a society in which incest between siblings is tolerated in any way. So yeah, like a romance, but like not
in quite a literal sense. That's a really good point. I mean, I know I'm kind of leaning on this essay, Is Gender Necessary, that Le Guin writes about this, but she does gesture, actually. She sort of hand waves the whole incest thing in a quite interesting way. And I think it comes from her knowledge of things like anthropology. Off the top of my head, she sort of was like, oh, well, you know, the incest taboo is something that we have in most societies, but siblings, it's generally allowed in history or something. And I was like, is it? And then I was actually thinking about it, and if you look at, say, ancient Egyptian cultures, particularly amongst like aristocracy. So if anyone's interested, it's on page 168 of the edition I'm using. Le Guin says there are 2 forbidden acts which might be taboo or illegal or simply considered contemptible depending on which of the regions of Gethin you're in. First, you don't pair off with a relative of a different generation, one who might be your own parent or child, so i.e. siblings are allowed. Second, you may mate but not vow chemering, which is what you were saying, Bean, with your own sibling. These are old incest prohibitions. They are so general among us, and with good cause, I think, not so much genetic as psychological, that they seem likely to be equally valid on Gethin. I feel like that needs an explanation, you know, in terms of anthropological history or something. I mean, maybe it's my own sort of social conditioning and things like that, but as I say, I think she does draw on her knowledge of either ancient cultures or non-Western cultures and potential taboos that might be picked up and put down from various things. But yeah, Bean, I think that's a really rich reading, and I think you're right. It is a bromance in a very queer sense in terms of the context. Yeah, totally.
I wanted to turn into talking a little bit more about Orgorian, because this is kind of the nation where I initially got a sense that there was some reference to the Soviet Union with how the nation was depicted. And then when I was discussing with both of you beforehand, when Bean raised the point to me that this could be the case, I was like, it just reinforced it to me to an even greater extent. And understanding that the book was written in a time period where the Cold War was quite a significant factor of kind of everyday life. Because I mean, if also something really interesting, although I'm not sure it would have been a factor behind Le Guin taking inspiration from the Soviet Union, was the Prague Spring reforms, which happened in kind of 1968. And they were a set of reforms being passed in Czechoslovakia to increase democratization, these sorts of things, and to merge a bit more of kind of free market economics and make it a bit less of a planned economy. And during this time, the Soviet Union, leading the Warsaw Pact, sent in tanks to stop this process of democratization. And I was just wondering if kind of these sorts of intense events combined with things like the space race that was going on at the same time, the Cuban Missile Crisis that was like 7 to 6 years beforehand, all these sorts of factors playing a part into why Le Guin decided to depict that nation as very similar in certain aspects to the Soviet Union, because it is an intensive bureaucracy and it is a police state. Essentially, that the staff within it are essentially a secret police. They are dedicated to eradicating things that may be a threat to the nation. One thing I find amazing about it, and one of the most interesting factors, is whenever anyone mentions them, you get a very vague description of what the staff are and what their acts are. And that to me makes them even a bit more threatening, because no one really wants to even talk to you about what is going on, because they are also afraid. And this kind of sense of fear and control and just very ominous presence, it very much reminded me of that. And then the voluntary farms also, which is a farm that Genli gets sent to. Genli is trying to convince the people who lead Orgorian to participate in the ecumen. And what happens is that he gets betrayed and he gets sent to a voluntary farm. And this very much evoked the Gulag perspectives that were coming out during the time. So the novel One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was translated into English and published in 1963. So this is when the English publication came out. And so this sort of would have been kind of in the ideas of probably quite a lot of people during the time, and describes kind of the intense cold, the starvation that is going on. And these are very much reflected in what is going on in the voluntary farms themselves.
So in the reading that I did in preparation for today, I came across an interview with Ursula Guin. So where Le Guin was being interviewed by an anthropology scholar and asked about how anthropology really informs her writing. And there's a really interesting passage where Le Guin writes that paradoxically, I believe that's what freed me to be a regional writer, which in many ways I am. I may pretend to be writing about other worlds, but my roots are obviously and profoundly in the West Coast. So while the sort of state of Augarane really does have sort of strong resonance with the USSR and what was going on at the time in terms of the Cold War between nations, the name is also Oregon, but with more letters kind of crammed in there, which is where Ursula Guin lives. And so there are ways in which, while the text is on one level speaking to this sort of what's going on in terms of international conflicts, there's also, I guess, sort of internal to the US. And we might also think about the Japanese internment camps that were happening during the Second World War and the sort of, I believe that was taking place on the west coast of the US. So there are ways in which what happens on these voluntary farms, which of course are not voluntary, they're prison camps, they're concentration camps, that is not just about sort of what's going on over there, but what has gone on here in the US from Ursula Guin's perspective, of course.
Yeah, but I fully agree. And that leads really nicely into something I was going to say, which is that also there's a prescription of drugs to these people who are within the voluntary farm. They get prescribed drugs to essentially keep them in a permanent state of chema, which apparently makes the population more submissive, I think. I think that is the intent of doing that, and it is to enhance greater control. And that is quite interesting because it does remind me of the use of kind of psychotropic drugs in prisons to essentially medicate the prison population and to control them, which was done in the US, done in the UK. And I think Ursula Guin would have been aware of this, but even also aware of kind of potentially the controversies that are also occurring over mental health institutions at the time and deinstitutionalization, which occurs a bit later, but also could have been a factor in documenting this kind of use of medication to control a population.
So my understanding was that the drugs stopped chema, so you never had it. But in either case, these drugs take away from these people or these beings something that is actually like, although they don't have a sense of gender or realistically even a sense of sex as part of their identity, I think it's still built into the environment that their sexuality and having a time of chema and a time of kind of sexual kind of activity is still a part of their liberty. And it's still, you know, the fact that you have chema houses and stuff like that, like it's a very, very social, I mean, of course, like, you know, being sexual is quite social, but, you know, you get what I mean. So having that in whichever way it actually is in the text, having that stripped from those people is one of the ways I think is most heartbreakingly the way that you take your liberty from someone. You know, James, you may well want to comment on this because of your expertise in prisons, but fairly recently the Centre for the Study of Women and Gender did an online screening of 3 Hours to Love, which is a Portuguese film that you can watch for free on Women's Voices Now. It describes women in Portuguese prisons who are experiencing things like touch starvation, and they miss their sexual partners, they miss their children, and it's sort of about their lead up time to what we would call like a conjugal visit, I guess. So I'm quite interested in this intersection between prisons, drugs, and a withholding of one's sexuality away from oneself by an external force of some description. I think that's really rich and I think really upsetting actually when you sort of really get into it.
Yeah, and I think the idea of kind of the politics of being able to touch and being able to have contact with other people. I'm not sure about this documentary because I haven't seen it. Was it during the pandemic?
So we screened it during the pandemic online, but the actual documentary I think was filmed a couple of years ago. I think it's still fairly recent, but it was pre-pandemic. Yeah, this was absolutely why we screened it. Obviously, we don't want to align experiences of being in lockdown with all our creature comforts and other liberty available to us. But for those who live alone and things like that, you know, there was a lot that resonated with, as you say, this inability to touch and the politics around, you know, withholding affection and not being able to, you know, access other people physically, whether that's romantically or just platonically.
Yeah, what I wanted to say was, in addition to this, is because the idea of not being able to have that access is enhanced by the pandemic, obviously, in prisons themselves. So there is a restriction on kind of the amount of people that can visit them and can actually provide not only the physical contact, but the emotional and social contact that is necessary for anyone to maintain those connections outside of prison itself, which is often a very, very difficult process.
But to return to what you were saying about this kind of Soviet context, I mean, as someone who doesn't know very much about this history myself, I mean, the easy reading that I'm going to throw out there is just even the environment. You know, there's loads of really famous history about how Russia, or what we now know as Russia, is, you know, really difficult to invade because you send your armies in and then the winter is just too much and it's inhospitable, and if you don't know the environment you can't get there. And I wonder if this is actually indicated a little bit towards the end of the novel, where Genliai and Eshtravan have a long trek, again, the fan fiction writes itself, across this inhospitable environment that they cannot tame and they cannot overcome, but the politics is what is moving them across that environment.
There's something else which is interesting, which is the trip to the voluntary farm itself, which is in particularly intense because essentially people, because of the cold, because of the limited food given, the amount of people who were already ill that die on that journey. And that did remind me a little bit of Baltic deportations. So the deportations of people in Baltics to prisons in Russia. And it reminded me of that because there were a significant amount of deaths during those deportations as well. And the particular types of cars that were being used did not have heating, which is incredibly dangerous, obviously. I mean, there weren't cars. Sorry, I should clarify that. There were cattle cars. So it's essentially, it looks like a train, essentially. That's kind of what it looks like from the outside. Yeah. I wanted to ask another question, maybe a bit diverting the topic slightly to something else, if that's okay. Something that came up when I was reviewing broader literature, and I wondered what you made of it, of people who interpreted Genli as having a bit of a journey from being more kind of sexist and not understanding the concept of no gender, and to someone who was more accepting of the society around them. But I wondered your thoughts on this, because I have my own, but I wanted to know what you thought of this narrative, because it has been interpreted like this before, and I've seen it interpreted like this, and I'm not sure about it. I'm not going to lie.
Well, the temporality of the text is quite strange, because we're introduced at the very beginning to the fact that this is a narrativization presented in lieu of a more standard report to the acumen. And so everything that we're being presented with is edited and selected, you know, within the world of the text, edited and selected by Genliai from some later point in time. There are these moments in the text where Genliai is reminding the reader that this is a text that's been produced sort of after the fact, a kind of remembering of what happened and rethinking, or showing us that he's been thinking about these memories more recently, but we're not quite sure exactly what sort of future point in time this narrative has been written by Genliai. And we also don't know to what extent Genliai has edited the extracts from Eshtravan's journals or rewritten aspects. So we know that what we're reading is mediated through Genliai's gaze, but we never have a real sense of to what extent he's kind of messed with the text. And I mean, I can't remember if he writes anywhere that he himself was writing down notes and journals. I think there's a point where he talks about Eshtravan's very almost religious habit of keeping a journal and making notes about what happened. And so to what extent are we reading this text as a narrative written by Genliai, but that itself depends very heavily on Eshtravan's recording of events, because maybe there are aspects that Genliai, because he didn't keep this sort of strict journal or keep up with making notes, that there are sort of lapses in his memory that he's filled in with Eshtravan's notes, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense.
So he's a really unreliable narrator, but we can't know to what extent.
No, I think one of the interesting things about this text is exactly as you say, it's this mediated text. So obviously Ursula Guin is also herself, the ape of all of this, right? So we can't be like, well, maybe they're really like this, but she presents them this way, because it's all imaginary anyway, if you see what I mean. But, there's a lot of criticism about how androgyny in this text is approached from quite a masculine perspective. But then at the same time, you have to account for the fact that we have a masculine narrator who was socialized as male and, has all these biases that I guess is meant to be our fish out of water kind of invite into this very unfamiliar world. Like, we are the alien, right? As we follow it through. And, in the earlier parts of the text, Gedaliah talks about, or writes down about, how you've got these beings who are quite emotional and they can be quick to cry and stuff, which I guess was a gesture towards, for want of a better term, like a gesture towards misogyny angled at people who are androgynous. So I completely see what you mean about this trajectory. And then, of course, by the end, as we've already discussed, we've got this like interesting bromance, however we want to frame that, where, and by the end of the text, when his own kind of Terrans or Earthlings kind of come and, complete the intergalactic diplomatic mission that he's on, he sees them as, the way that he describes them actually is he's really internalized this Gethin kind of understanding of gender. So I'm on page 241 of the edition that I'm using, which is an Orbit book, science fiction edition. Le Guin writes, but they all looked strange to me, men and women, well as I knew them. Their voices sounded strange, too deep, too shrill. They were like a troop of great, strange animals of two different species, great apes with intelligent eyes, all of them in rut, in Kemmer. They took my hand, touched me, held me. So you get the sense that he's like absorbed the values of winter. So from being like, oh, you're all crying a bunch, that's really strange, to look at these great apes with their Kemmer perversion. But there's obviously a sense of trajectory there for sure. But given what you've said already, being where the initial stuff is his remembrance, how reliable is this trajectory? Or I don't know.
There's something about it that feels a little bit over exaggerated to me, like an attempt to affirm his affinity with Githenians based on his love and loss of estrogen. To me, it seems more of an identification that doesn't necessarily undo some of the biases in his thinking, that maybe is more about stating a sense of difference and distance from the humans that he's actually kind of biologically or genetically closer to, as a way to kind of affirm a closer connection with the Gethanians that he's formed a more sort of social bond with. I'm not fully convinced that he's totally internalized and sort of Githenian philosophies, or that he's somehow, been released from his more problematic views and assumptions, because he spent how long? A period of months, maybe years on Gethin, as opposed to the whole rest of his life that he's had on Earth and with other, as Le Guin puts it, bisexual humanoids. But that is one of the sort of sad things about the planet Gethin, is that they don't have large mammals. They don't have birds, and they don't seem to have pets in the same way. There's no cuddly animals to cuddle up to. There aren't dogs. It's quite a sort of empty of wildlife in some ways. There are those, I guess, there's sort of a bit like rabbity things that they shoot and eat some of.
Yeah, you're right. The animal life is really desolate on winter. Which, I agree. How utopian could a world be if? I mean, on the one hand, obviously, Le Guin is trying to say that they live in their relationship to the environment isn't something that they feel like they should be mastering. They just sort of work with it. So, for instance, with the doors that you have for summer and the doors you have for winter, because there's so much snow, so you have a door higher up, right? They adapt around the environment rather than bending the environment to them. But part of the environment that, as you say, is missing is animals and animal life. So as human beings on Earth in real life, we pack bond with things, including objects, which is one of the weirdest things about our psychology, I guess. We pack bond with other animals and other beings, and on winter there just doesn't seem to be that, interspecies kind of reliance or reliability even, that maybe Genlei is their pet, like maybe it is the cuddly animal that they because they refer to him in animal terms, or they could, they have terms for male female animal that they don't have for the humanoid, the people, citizen beings that he then adopts at the end in that quote that I read out just earlier, where he sort of says that they're apes. These are his own people. Anyway, I know that apes aren't pets, and you should not keep apes as pets. Anyway.
Good.
good disclaimer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and exactly, going to Bean's point about linking it to queer utopia, and can it be a utopia if it doesn't have these things that give us so much joy in a lot of ways? Yeah, and again, because of this animal thing, and also other things that happen on the planet, because even it being so cold, the lack of companionship, there is a sense that it's not a queer utopia. There is a definite sense that it's actually thought experiment, and that it's tricky to fit into a queer utopia as such because of that, because it doesn't try to idealize, although there are certain very really cool aspects of the society that are amazing, obviously.
So when I was reapproaching this text for this podcast, I was like, oh, maybe it is a queer utopia, because as I say, the way that families arranged and things like that, and where the burden of child rearing is, coming at it from the perspective of thinking about it as a historical second wave feminist text, although I don't necessarily think Le Guin would have identified herself as such, but thinking about it from that perspective, I was like, oh yeah, I bet there's something utopian in it. But actually, this society is, in the thought experiment, Le Guin herself writes that it is. This society is on the verge of war. You have inter-country or international conflict. One of the things I really appreciate about this text, actually, is that it's a sci-fi novel that doesn't treat one planet as a homogenous society either. In more contemporary stuff and in softer sci-fi, there's a real reliance on, like, you have a whole planet that has one language and one religion and one way of living, which at least we get two here, which is quite nice. But to kind of go back to your point that you were making, how utopian can anything be if you still have like a sense of hierarchy, even? So you still have a king, you still have a prime minister. Maybe I'm approaching this from too like wilder perspective, but I don't necessarily know how successful the rearrangement of family life and family responsibility is from a perspective of actually liberating people.
I think this ties in with some of Ursula Le Guin's thoughts on utopia and utopias, which she explores in other texts that she's written. Firstly, I think of this text more as a critique of utopia and of utopian thinking, which is something she looks at in The Lathe of Heaven, which is a text about somebody with the power to kind of change the world through his dreams, who then gets manipulated by a sleep therapist, megalomaniac, sort of, I guess, psychoanalyst. And there are hints in the text. I think one of the previous anthropological figures from the Ecumen hypothesizes that the people who live on Gethen are the result of some monstrous experiment, and the sort of resonances there with obviously sort of Nazi experiments on people, and sort of genetic experimentation and cloning and these kind of ideas that have been explored a lot in science fiction already. But there's this sense in which maybe it wasn't intended as a monstrous experiment. It wasn't intended as a kind of something simply amoral or immoral, or intended as some sort of like reckless experimentation, but perhaps was intended as a sort of feminist project. Yeah, like experiment with doing away with what Ursula Le Guin calls bisexuality, or I don't know what the proper scientific term for bimorphic have, with the sort of development in sort of intersex theory. We might want to trouble that quite a bit more, but the logic that Ursula Le Guin is kind of working with is this idea of humans as having two sexes, or being a sort of binary sex. With that in mind, like this sort of sense of the text as being like a failed utopia, that is something that Le Guin thinks about a lot in other works, and thinks about utopia instead of being this kind of blueprint, instead of being like this sort of perfect world that we're hoping to kind of get to. She's often thinking about utopia as a process, as something that's never finished, that's a sort of ongoing revolution. And that's something that she looks at in The Dispossessed, which I believe was the sort of next text that she wrote after Left Hand of Darkness, and which is sort of almost like the origin story of the Ansible, which is this radio type device that enables simultaneous communication between people across galactic distances.
Ursula Le Guin invented the internet. she invented Zoom.
I really love that interpretation of Ursula Le Guin's work because I think it is very fitting. I think it's maybe one of the reasons why we all love discussing her work, maybe, because it's never clear cut. It's always in this mesh of grey. It can't really be called strictly utopia. It can't really be called strictly dystopia. It has this kind of natural flux, which is present within everything in the world, where it is not a clear-cut, amazing realm, or it's not a clear-cut, terrible place. It has elements that are amazing, but also elements that are kind of damaging for the population who live within it.
And just from the perspective of, good literature, like, let's not forget, obviously, that this is a storybook and this is something that needs to sell copies and, all these things. And so how interesting would it actually be to us to just have a 200-page novel about how amazing this imaginary place is when nothing bad ever happens? Coming from my own perspective as looking at lots of feminist fiction, there's no feminist fiction that's like, here is this lady person and she has an amazing life and she's completely empowered and look at her go, amazing, done, the end of the novel. Because it's not that interesting, first of all. You need some sort of conflict and an act structure to have a story move forward traditionally. But also from, to kind of gesture back to what you were saying, being like, to me, feminist fiction or fiction that has any kind of like liberation ideology at its core should be asking the question. And in order to, this is why we write theses that are 80,000 words long, sometimes 100,000 words long. It's because there's no simple answers to things. And these are just metaphors of ways of like thinking differently about, do we need gender in the way that we do in order to have sex that is bimorphic, maybe, which we, as you rightly point out, now know that is something that we should be troubling and thinking further about. But the point being is that, if this were truly a utopia, would we even have a novel in the first place? Because we could just imagine a nice place in our brains and be done with it. The interesting stuff is in the question and is in when things go wrong, they go wrong in a way that reflects the ways that things go wrong here in our own world and in our own time. For instance, there's lots of criticism about how being on the precipice of war, Le Guin was kind of questioning, well, is war a inherently gendered thing to happen? And, kind of, if you boil it back down to the fact that we have these familial structures that rely on gender, and even in this world, your flesh children are different to the children that you sire, and that there's kind of still bubbles of a sense of like ownership or a sense of genetic kind of legitimacy. And, who owns the land, therefore, as inhospitable and as desolate as that land may be, is still a question that most societies grapple over, whether they're a patriarchy or matriarchy or neither.
I just wanted to just go back to a moment to something that you just said, Roxanne, the problem of how to make utopias readable, because so many feminist utopias are really plagued with this problem of ending up being quite boring explanations of just this better world, just describing how everything is different, and that does not make for a very compelling story. And that's something that Le Guin was very conscious of, because at heart Le Guin really is a storyteller above all other things. So I think ethnography and anthropology became really important for Le Guin in terms of how to manage writing utopian type texts, or texts that are imagining an alternative world or a different world, whether or not that world is better or worse, because it offers these kind of devices to have these sections of the text that are giving this sort of explanatory, okay, well, this is how the families are organized, and this is how the government is organized, and this is how they organize time without that feeling too dull, too explanatory. So that is a really interesting way in which ethnography really feeds into Le Guin's writing.
Okay, so I think we've potentially agreed that this isn't any kind of queer utopia, but what happens to our reading of the text maybe if we read it as a queer dystopia? Is there is this potentially the disastrous outcome of all these questions? I mean, just as a question.
I think when it comes to a queer dystopia, one thing that I do find interesting is that it seems to be on the verge, if that makes sense. It's on the verge of devolving into war. So it is not there. It's hinted at that this may occur. And it's interesting because the way of the ecumen and the appearance of it seem to be a way around the conflict, a way around the war, and a way to skirt it completely by essentially having an alliance. Although, even though I'm saying that now, I'm actually not sure if I believe what I'm saying, because actually, even though I am inherently suspicious of the ecumen, because they give a certain colonial vibe in certain aspects, even though they are framed purposefully by Le Guin not to evoke that, I think they do because of the problem of disingenuous promises. Actually, something being mentioned earlier, because Genli is so central to the narrative, I don't know any other real perspective on the ecumen apart from Genli's. And this kind of traps me in a cycle where I'm like, I am inherently suspicious of you, and I don't know if you will actually be enough to prevent a conflict, or whether you will just incite more.
Certainly, the ecumen seems to be presented as this utopian promise of knowledge and skill exchange and the possibilities of new technologies that might make things a lot easier, might make life sort of move beyond simple, what I think gets talked about as sort of simply survival on Gethin, like this idea that maybe that life on this planet could be made actually a lot more comfortable by these kind of trade of goods and food stuff and materials. Yeah, but that there is this this undertone that certainly if you have read other texts by Le Guin that are set in the same kind of universe, a sense in which there are still these sort of politics internal to the ecumen that we're not really aware of, and that there's a certain way in which Genli appears to be kind of condescending, and the ecumen more generally has been condescending towards Gethin, even presenting them as just basically scraping by on this frozen planet doesn't really do service to, or doesn't do justice to, the societies that they have developed that are really ingenious in dealing with the temperature, and that they have these really rich mythologies and a really strong sense of culture and a certain kind of a fashion. Like, I found myself really wanting a Hebe, one of these sort of long tunics. Like, it would be super comfy to wear, and I'm always really cold, so like clothing that is really like made for that environment, I think would be really fantastic. Sort of, there's a sense in which they're sort of like simple and yet really comfy, and maybe Genli can't really see this or doesn't want to see this, but they are sort of like dresses. Like, that word never comes into the text, but then everybody's wearing like these sort of comfy, like cold weather muumuus.
But, it's interesting you say dress, though, because obviously, well, maybe not obviously, there are non-Western cultures that live in all kinds of environments where men wear clothing that we would more readily assign to women in our Western kind of gaze as well. So I wonder if, Le Guin's own interest in Eastern cultures, her awareness of these things would have kind of played into the fashion of Gethin. And just to kind of build on what you were saying, there is actually a moment where Genli writes that they have technologies, but it was something about like they absorb these technologies rather than trying to kind of keep up with them. And there's a sense of like the slow in this that I find really interesting. They have automobiles, but they only go like 20 miles an hour at most, like the sense of things taking time. And, again, I wonder in the 1960s, my tech history isn't amazing. I know by the 1980s, we're starting to get personal computers and things more readily, but I wonder if this was kind of starting to be in the cultural zeitgeist at the time. As I say, I'm not totally sure myself, but I wonder if kind of on the edge of, on that precipice, there's a little bit of a Mary Shelley's Frankenstein fear of the upcoming technology that could be shared due to the space race. Actually, that's thinking about it from that perspective. We shared these technologies, how far would we go? But it was a space race. Things were lost and things were spent in the pursuit of having better and faster and quicker ways to get to the moon. There's definitely something there, I think, for sure.
There's something very interesting about this being a planet that's not quite made its way out of the Ice Age. That is really quite cool. There's something very intriguing about reading this book now when we know that the Industrial Revolution is one moment that you can point to as a starting point for the sort of man-made climate change that we are living through now. So knowing that we're on a planet that is heating up and heating up fast. I know that Le Guin was very interested in, and throughout her life was very interested in ecology and ideas around climate change and living more, I guess, in harmony with your surroundings and environment and environmental issues. And that's something that she looked at, I guess, a bit more in The Word for World is Forest, a later text that's sort of also very much about the Vietnam War. But yeah, I wondered how much at the time of Le Guin's writing this text, how much was known in the public consciousness about the environmental damage that was being done and what shape that would take.
I think this is a really interesting note to end on, essentially thinking about possible links we can draw between climate change and the work of Le Guin and ways to essentially live a bit more harmoniously with nature. Finally, I want to conclude by saying thank you both so much. It has been an absolute joy to have you on. The insights you have brought to this topic are amazing and far better than anything I could have achieved on my own. So thank you again. I also wanted to say thank you to the listeners, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Queer Disrupt podcast. Do you want to hear more? Well, check out our Podbean where we host all of our podcasts, but you should be able to find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you normally find your podcasts. But please let us know if we're not where you usually get yours. And rate and subscribe to us. It really helps us genuinely. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So follow us there to stay up to date on all of our events and catch up on when we release our tickets for upcoming events. All of our events have limited numbers, so make sure you subscribe to be the first in for a chance. Our website is queerdisrupt.com, so check us out there. And finally, all of the work is produced by us for free, but making these events and podcasts are expensive. We rely on the generosity of you, our amazing audience, to keep us going and producing everything we do for free. Pop onto queerdisrupt.com and click on the donate button. Every penny you give goes straight back into producing more content for you to listen and watch to for free. Thank you and catch you next time.